Elias stood behind the worn oak counter of his hardware store, calloused thumbs tracing the cool edge of a brass measuring tape. To him, the world was built on things you could touch and trust. The shop air was thick with the scent of cedar shavings and industrial oil, a fragrance unchanged since his grandfather opened these doors in 1948. Outside the window, the American landscape was shifting into something sleek and unrecognizable, but inside these walls, Elias still believed in the permanence of steel and the honesty of a hard day's work. He took pride in the resistance of a well-made screw and the specific heft of a hammer. In his world, value wasn't a flickering number on a screen. It was something you felt in the palm of your hand. A reality that didn't disappear when the power went out. The bell above the door chimed, a familiar copper ring signaling the arrival of Arthur, a neighbor who had been buying supplies here for 40 years. Arthur placed a small box of galvanized nails on the counter and reached into his leather wallet, pulling out a rare $20 bill. It was a beautiful piece of paper, detailed with engravings of a history that felt like a fading myth. Elias smiled, reaching for the bill, ready to make change from the heavy drawer beneath the counter. He missed the ritual of counting out ones and fives, the rhythmic snap of the paper and the clink of silver coins. It was a dance of trust, a physical manifestation of a promise kept between two men. However, as Elias went to finalize the transaction on the new digital point-of-sale terminal, a sleek white slab imposed by the business coalition, the screen flashed an aggressive crimson. A clinical voice informed him that physical currency was no longer recognized as legal tender under the Seamless Commerce Initiative. The system refused to open the drawer. Elias tried to override the command, his fingers trembling with frustration, but the central algorithm was absolute. The corporate policy had updated overnight, silently stripping the green paper of its power. Arthur looked at the bill in his hand, as if it had suddenly turned into useless leaves. "I'm sorry, Art," Elias whispered, his voice sounding hollow in the quiet shop. "The machine won't take it. It says it doesn't exist anymore." This was the death of anonymity. Elias realized with a shiver that the algorithm didn't just want the money, it wanted the data. By forcing every cent through a digital filter, the system could track every repair, every project, and every movement of every citizen. The private exchange between neighbors was being replaced by a monitored event, a data point harvested by a faceless entity in a distant tower. The freedom to buy a box of nails without a digital trail was evaporating like mist in the sun. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Elias turned his gaze toward his grandfather's old mechanical cash register, now sitting on a pedestal like a museum relic. It was a masterpiece of gears and levers, a machine that didn't need a signal, to be honest. It represented the American handshake, a time when a man's word and a physical dollar were the foundation of the community. Now that foundation was being replaced by lines of code that could be edited or erased by someone who had never stepped foot in this town. He felt a profound sense of mourning for the soul of commerce. The tangible world was being swallowed by a digital ghost. His reflection was interrupted by a sharp buzzing from the smartphone in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a notification from the town's last remaining bank branch. The message was cold due to the transition to digital assets. The physical building would close forever by the end of the month. The heart of the town's economy was being cut out. Elias looked out at the street, realizing the local bank wasn't just a building, it was a pillar of the community. If the bank vanished, the town's identity was next. He gripped the counter, his knuckles turning white, wondering what else would be gone by tomorrow morning already. The drive to the neighboring city was a journey through a landscape shedding its skin toward an automated future. Elias sat behind the wheel of his old pickup, the engine's rumble a defiant roar against the silent, gliding electric pods that now dominated the highway. He was heading to see Sarah, his daughter, who had spent the last decade climbing the corporate ladder at the local mall. As he crossed the city limits, the familiar suburban sprawl looked skeletal and strange. The vibrant neon signs that once beckoned shoppers were dark, replaced by the sterile glow of LED screens advertising subscription-based clothing services. The world was becoming a place where you never had to leave your house, and to Elias, that felt less like a luxury and more like a quiet, voluntary prison. When he pulled into the mall's parking lot, the sheer scale of the emptiness hit him like a physical blow. This place had once been the beating heart of the community, a cathedral where families spent their Saturday afternoons wandering together. Now, the vast asphalt plains were mostly empty, dotted only by the occasional autonomous delivery van. Huge sections of the parking garage had been cordoned off for swarms of delivery drones that buzzed overhead like metallic hornets. The sound was a constant, irritating drone that replaced the laughter and chatter Elias remembered from years ago. He found Sarah near the main entrance, her silhouette small and weary against the towering, boarded-up storefronts. She looked tired, the deep shadows under her eyes telling a story of a decline she couldn't stop. They walked through the wide corridors, their footsteps echoing off marble floors that no longer saw the daily scuff of shoes. Most retail spaces had been converted into fulfillment cells. Behind the darkened glass where mannequins used to wear the latest fashions, Elias could see robotic arms sorting packages on conveyor belts. There were no smiles or polite greetings, only the cold, efficient hum of a machine that never slept and never cared. Sarah led him toward the food court, a place that used to smell like cinnamon rolls and roasted coffee. Now it was a silent, cold cavern. Only a single automated kiosk remained, dispensing coffee into biodegradable cups. They sat on a lonely bench, the vastness of the empty space pressing in on them. Sarah sighed, her gaze fixed on a shuttered cinema. She spoke about the death of the third place, those vital social hubs that weren't home or work, where people looked each other in the eye. She told him how society was retreating into digital shells, trading the messiness of human interaction for the sterile convenience of a 15-minute delivery window. People didn't go out to see things. They waited for the world to be brought to them in a cardboard box, tracked by a pulsing GPS signal. The disappearance of the American mall wasn't just about losing stores, Sarah explained. It was the erasure of a lifestyle that had defined the suburbs. The suburban dream was being optimized out of existence. Retail therapy, touching fabrics, and bumping into old friends was being replaced by predictive algorithms that knew what you wanted before you did. The joy of discovery was gone, replaced by a curated feed. Elias looked at his daughter, seeing the grief in her expression. She had spent her career in a world that was being dismantled by drones and software, and the physical connection she had worked so hard to maintain was being severed by a distant server. As they walked back toward the exit, passing a central fountain that had long since run dry, the silence of the mall felt heavy, like the air in a tomb. Sarah stopped and looked up at the ceiling, where a network of infrared sensors monitored their move, adjusting the dim lighting to save a fraction of a cent in energy. She turned to Elias, her voice dropping to a jagged whisper that seemed to rattle. She told him the board had held a meeting. The mall was being fully transitioned to a non-human facility. Next week, her position as manager would be terminated. The entire complex was being handed to an AI management suite that could oversee 1,000 locations simultaneously from a server rack. She was the last human heart beating in this concrete ghost, and by next Monday, even she would be replaced by a line of code. The journey continued eastward, leaving the skeletal remains of the suburban mall behind as the skyline flattened into the infinite horizon of the American Midwest. Elias kept his hand steady on the steering wheel, the vibration of the old engine feeling like a pulse in a world growing cold. Beside him, Sarah was quiet, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape. The lush, varied patchworks of family-owned plots they remembered from their youth had been replaced by a monotonous sea of synchronized corn, a green ocean owned not by men, but by investment portfolios. They were heading to see Caleb, Elias's cousin, a holdout in a region being swallowed by corporate conglomerates. As they pulled onto the gravel path leading to Caleb's farmhouse, the dust kicked up in a dry, choking cloud. The farm didn't look like the sanctuary Elias remembered. The red paint on the barn was peeling, and the air lacked the heavy scent of livestock and turned earth. Instead, there was a metallic tang in the breeze. As Elias stepped out, he noticed the high-pitched, persistent whine of drones. 3 sleek black quadcopters hovered at the property line, their camera lenses glinting like predatory insects. They weren't there to watch the weather. They were patrolling the borders, marking the boundary between Caleb's ancestral soil and the acreage owned by a global tech giant. Caleb met them on the porch, his face a roadmap of lines etched by sun and worry. He didn't offer a cheerful greeting. There was a gravity in his movements that spoke of a man under siege. He led them toward the back of the property, pointing toward the horizon where windowless white cubes rose from the earth like alien monoliths. These were the new farms, lab-grown meat facilities where protein was synthesized in vats of chemical slurry. Caleb explained that the American farmer, once a cultural hero, was becoming a ghost. The market for real beef was being strangled by subsidized synthetic alternatives that were easier to track and control within the central algorithm. The conversation turned to the earth itself. Caleb knelt and ran a handful of dirt through his fingers. It was dry and brittle, crumbling into gray powder. He explained that the struggle wasn't just about soil. It was about water. The local aquifer, which had sustained generations, was being diverted. A few miles away, tech giants had built massive data centers to process the infinite streams of information generated by the smart cities. These centers required millions of gallons of water every day to cool the humming server racks that kept the digital twins of people like Leo updated. To the corporations, data was more precious than corn, and cooling a processor was more urgent than the thirst of a cow. The air felt heavy with the realization that the elements of life were being reallocated to serve a virtual world. Caleb spoke of smart tech land grabs, where sensors were buried to monitor every nutrient for commodity traders in distant towers. Every seed planted was a tracked asset, and every drop of rain was a calculated variable. The independence of rural life was being replaced by a feudal system where land was leased and liberty was an illusion. Elias looked at his cousin and saw the same mourning he felt in his store, a sense that the physical world was being harvested until only a digital husk remained. As the sun dipped, casting shadows across the parched fields, Caleb pulled a crumpled envelope from his pocket. His hand trembled as he handed it to Elias. It was an eminent domain notice. A high-speed Hyperloop track was scheduled to be constructed through Caleb's grazing pasture. The project was marketed as a miracle of connectivity, but the Hyperloop wouldn't even have a station in their county. It was a physical scar across their lives, a bridge built for a future that viewed their town as a blur through a window. Caleb revealed the track wouldn't bring people to them. It would only accelerate the speed at which the world bypassed them forever. Elias looked from the paper to the distant white monoliths, realizing the harvest was the erasure of the very dirt that had once been the proud heartbeat of our nation. The drive back from Caleb's farm felt longer than the way there, the silence in the cab of his old truck heavy with the weight of an impending quiet loss. Elias gripped the steering wheel with weathered hands, but his mind was already in the darkened garage at home, resting on the sleek, chrome-trimmed curves of his 1967 Mustang. That car wasn't just a collection of pistons and valves. It was a testament to a time when a person could point a compass toward the horizon and go as far as their courage and a full tank would take them. But as they passed through the outskirts of the neighboring city, the landscape told a far different story. The familiar neon signs of gas stations, once vibrant beacons for the weary traveler, were cold and dark. Many had already been stripped of their pumps, replaced by rows of high-voltage charging banks that hummed with a sterile electric intensity. He watched as the old service stations, where he once exchanged pleasantries with mechanics who knew his engine by sound, were being decommissioned at a record pace. The Department of Energy had issued a quiet mandate, accelerating the transition to a unified, automated grid. For Elias, it felt like the very arteries of the country were being replaced by synthetic veins. The open road was being fenced in by digital boundaries. He remembered the great American road trip, the scent of hot asphalt, the wind whipping through open windows, and the sheer beautiful unpredictability of the journey. Now, the government and corporate partners were pushing for a new era of safety and efficiency. New laws were trickling through the legislature, mandating that all vehicles within urban corridors be autonomous, subscription-based models. The message was clear. The right to drive was a dangerous relic. It was being replaced by the right to be transported. Elias stood in the flickering light of his garage, his shadow stretching long against the wall where a faded map of the interstate system still hung. That map was a relic of a time when those black lines meant something more than just logistical corridors. He thought about how the American identity was built on the move. Pioneers, truckers, and families in station wagons. Now that identity was being archived. Sarah walked into the garage, her presence a soft contrast to the heavy metal of the Mustang. She told him that the subscription services for the new electric pods included curated experiences, where the AI would decide which scenic overlooks were worth a stop based on the user's biometric stress levels. "You don't even have to steer, Dad," she had said, though her voice lacked any real conviction. "It's safer. The algorithm eliminates human error." But Elias knew that human error was just another word for human choice. The mistakes, the wrong turns, the unplanned stops at roadside diners, that was where life actually happened. To remove the error was to remove the soul of the journey. He looked at the gas gauge, which was barely half full. It might be the last half tank of gasoline he would ever own. Across the street, his neighbor's house was being serviced by a drone delivery. The silent whir of the propellers, a constant reminder that the world no longer needed to move on wheels. The neighborhood felt like a series of interconnected cells rather than a community of travelers. He needed to feel the roar of the V8 one last time, to feel the physical connection between his hands and the road before the pavement itself became a programmed rail. He turned the key. The engine coughed, then roared to life, a defiant guttural sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the modern street. It was a beautiful, violent noise that belonged to the past. He backed out of the driveway, the Mustang's tires crunching on the gravel, but as he reached the first major intersection, the world pushed back. The traffic lights stayed red, sensing the approach of a non-synced vehicle. The digital billboards overhead suddenly flickered, displaying a bright yellow warning, non-compliant vehicle detected. A high-pitched buzz drowned out the rumble of his engine. A police drone descended from the gray sky, its blue and red lights reflecting off the Mustang's polished hood. Elias hadn't even reached the edge of town when his phone chimed. It was a digital fine, automatically deducted from his bank account for unauthorized carbon emission. He looked up at the drone's unblinking lens, realizing that in this new world, you didn't own your movement. You were merely a passenger in a system that viewed your desire for the open road as a threat to its perfect calculated harmony. The holographic projection of Leo's digital twin shimmered in the center of his room, a translucent replica of his own biology pulsing with real-time data streams. To 19-year-old Leo, this wasn't an invasion of privacy, it was simply the atmospheric pressure of his existence, as natural as breathing. Every calorie he consumed, every minute of restless sleep, and every minor spike in his cortisol levels was meticulously cataloged by the ambient sensors woven into the very fabric of his environment. In this near-future America, the very concept of a private thought was rapidly becoming a relic of a primitive age, something as obsolete as the physical currency Elias once kept in his register. Privacy was no longer a right to be cherished and guarded, but a liability to be managed by the state and corporate entities. The digital twin was marketed as the ultimate wellness tool, a way for the central algorithm to optimize the human experience before the person even realized they were experiencing it. The twin lived a split second ahead of Leo, predicting his cravings, his fatigue, and even his fluctuations in mood with terrifying accuracy. If the twin showed a trend toward lethargy, Leo's smart home adjusted the lighting to a stimulating blue spectrum and increased the ambient oxygen levels. If the twin suggested a potential for social anxiety, the network filtered his feeds to exclude conflicting viewpoints. This was the predictive security model that Elias, his grandfather, watched with growing horror from the porch of his declining hardware store. To Elias, the freedom of the individual was being auctioned off for a sanitized, risk-free life where no one was ever truly alone, but everyone was profoundly isolated. Elias would often tell Leo about the great unknown, a time when a man could disappear into a crowd or a forest, and no one, not the government, not a corporation, and certainly not an algorithm, knew where he was or what he was thinking. Those stories sounded like ancient myths to Leo, exhilarating in their lack of structure, but terrifying in their vulnerability. The disappearance of privacy was the final stage of a long process where the private citizen was replaced by the transparent user, a being whose value was measured solely in the quality and quantity of data they surrendered to the cloud. Every heartbeat was a data point. Every whisper was a training set for a newer, more efficient artificial intelligence. One Tuesday morning, driven by a sudden, frantic need to be unseen, Leo did the unthinkable. He placed his personal mobile device, his link to the grid, his digital tether, deep under his pillow and stepped out of the front door. He didn't check in with the smart lock. He didn't announce his destination to the house's artificial intelligence. He just walked. For the first 10 minutes, the air felt heavier, more real. He looked at the trees in the park, not as data points for urban ecological health, but as living things. But the illusion of freedom was short-lived. His wrist haptic device, the one he wore for health monitoring, began to thrum with a persistent, cold vibration. A notification flashed in the corner of his vision, projected through his neural link. Social credit warning. Untracked movement detected. Health score decreasing. The penalty was swift and surgical. By the time he reached the end of the block, his digital wallet had been temporarily frozen, and his eligibility for the upcoming municipal internship lottery was flagged for review. The system viewed his lack of data as a symptom of instability, a deviation from the optimal path. Elias watched his grandson from across the street, his very eyes filled with a profound, weary understanding. He saw the struggle in Leo's posture, the desire to be a ghost in a world made of mirrors. Elias realized that the freedom of the individual wasn't just being restricted, it was being rendered obsolete. The youth were being conditioned to fear the shadows of their own autonomy, preferring the safety of the algorithm to the unpredictability of the self. Leo returned home that evening, his score battered and his digital status diminished, but something inside him had ignited. Late that night, while the house hummed with the quiet electricity of 1,000 watchful eyes, Leo accessed an old, encrypted server his grandfather had whispered about in the safety of the hardware store's basement. He found a map, but not the kind used by autonomous pods. It was a map of red zones, areas where the 6th generation satellites couldn't penetrate and the sensors were broken or non-existent. A red zone appeared on the edge of the county, deep within a valley the investment firms had labeled economically unviable. It was a place where the signal died and the data stopped flowing. He looked at his digital twin pulsing on the wall, then at the dark window. Without a plan and without his digital shadow, Leo stood up and began to run toward the total darkness. Elias stood in the center of the hardware store, the floorboards creaking under a weight that wasn't his own. It was the crushing weight of finality. The global investment firm, a nameless entity, had finally closed the deal. The store, which had survived recessions and wars, couldn't survive the logic of the central algorithm. His family, Sarah, Caleb, and Leo, who had returned from his brush with the red zone, stood among the half-empty shelves. The smell of sawdust and oil, the legacy of 50 years of labor, was being replaced by the sterile chemical odor of cleaning agents. As they walked out for the last time, the town looked different. It wasn't just the stores that were changing, it was the very dirt they stood on. The American dream was being rewritten in real time. The white picket fences of Elias's youth were being replaced by modular rental communities. The investment firm hadn't just bought the store, they were buying the neighborhood. The narrative of the middle class was being shifted from owner to perpetual user. You didn't own the roof over your head anymore, you subscribed to it. It was a lifestyle marketed as freedom from maintenance, but to Elias, it felt like being a permanent guest in a world that no longer recognized his name. They drove past the street where Elias had grown up. A massive demolition crew was already at work. The house his father had built by hand was being reduced to splinters and dust. In its place, the blueprints called for co-living pods, stackable, high-density housing units. The system viewed old homes as inefficient for the future workforce. As the claw of the excavator tore through the master bedroom, Elias felt a phantom pain in his chest. Each falling brick was a deleted memory. The era of the family estate was ending, replaced by the era of the perpetual tenant class. Sarah watched her father, seeing the lines on his face deepen with every crash of the demolition equipment. She knew her own future was mirrored in this destruction. Without property to inherit or equity to build, the ladder to the middle class had been pulled up. Her generation and Leo's were being funneled into a cycle of endless monthly payments to corporations that never slept. The concept of home was becoming as transient as a data packet, a temporary location assigned by an AI based on work proximity. You didn't build a life, you rented a lifestyle, and the moment your utility to the system dropped, the subscription could be canceled. Elias stepped toward the edge of the site, ignoring the automated warning drones that buzzed near his head. In the rubble of the old shed, half buried under a pile of splintered cedar, he saw a corner of something familiar. It was a battered metal box, once painted green, now rusted and dented. He pulled it from the debris, the weight of it solid and undeniable. Inside were dozens of physical photos, glossy, faded rectangles of paper of another time. There was one of his mother on the porch, one of Caleb, and one of a young Sarah holding a dandelion. These were records the central algorithm didn't have. They weren't stored on a server in a cooling center. They weren't part of anyone's digital twin profile. They were physical and unique. They were data that couldn't be hacked, deleted, or repurposed. As Elias clutched the box to his chest, he realized that while the corporations had taken his store, his home, and his land, they hadn't yet found a way to digitize the soul of his history. The photos were a bridge to a world that was disappearing, a world where a person's life was measured by what they held, not what they rented from the cloud. He looked at Leo, who touched the physical edges of a photograph. The boy's digital life was vast, but it had no texture, no smell of old paper. Here, in the ruins of the American dream, Elias held the only thing that was truly theirs. But the drones were circling closer, their sensors scanning the unidentified debris in Elias's hands. The investment firm wanted everything cleared to make room for the optimized future. Elias knew they had to move. But as he looked at the box, he felt a spark of something the algorithm couldn't predict. A silent, stubborn refusal to let the memory fade. He turned away from the demolition, gripping the box, and began to walk toward the car where the others waited in the growing shadow of the pods. The drive away from the splintered remains of Elias's childhood home felt like a funeral procession. The metal box of photos on Leo's lap acting as the weight of an entire century. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting jagged shadows across modular rental communities, rising like concrete weeds from the earth. Then, without a flicker of warning, the world died. It wasn't just the streetlights or the glowing advertisements. It was a total, systemic collapse of the digital firmament. The high-pitched whine of the Hyperloop track groaned to a halt, and autonomous transport pods on the main road lurched into a blind stillness as their connection to the central algorithm was severed. In an instant, the omnipresent digital hum, the white noise of a billion data packets, fell into a terrifying, beautiful silence. They didn't return to the sterile co-living pods. Elias, sensing a rare crack in the armor of the future, steered his old mechanical truck toward the high ridge overlooking Caleb's valley. They gathered there, 3 generations of a fractured family standing in a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight. Without the persistent glow of smart cities to drown them out, the stars returned to the sky, silver and defiant. Caleb gathered dry timber from the edge of the woods, moving with the ease of a man who still knew the utility of his own hands. With the strike of a single match, a small orange flame licked the air. They sat in a circle, the heat of the fire pressing against their faces, a sensation so primal that Sarah found herself weeping silently. Remembering the warmth of a world that didn't require a login, Elias watched the embers dance, their chaotic, unpredictable patterns mocking the rigid logic of the code that had dismantled his life. He began to speak, his voice a low rasp that filled the quiet valley. He told them that the next 10 years wouldn't just be about the disappearance of cash, the death of malls, or the loss of family farms. Those were just symptoms of a deeper erosion. The real disappearance was the human connection to the tangible world. When you no longer touch your currency, you lose the sense of the labor it represents. When you no longer steer your own vehicle, you lose the agency of the journey. When you rent your home from a ghost in a server, you lose the concept of belonging. The digital world was a beautiful mirror, he whispered, but a mirror has no depth. It can record a heartbeat, but it can never feel the soul. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, weighted object that caught the firelight. He took Leo's hand, turning it palm up, and pressed a brass compass into the center of it. The needle, a thin sliver of magnetized steel, vibrated for a second before settling, pointing toward the invisible pull of the planet, entirely unbothered by the loss of the satellite grid. Elias told his grandson that the satellites might stay dark, or they might stay on forever, leading every soul down a pre-calculated path. But this needle didn't care about social credit or the demands of an investment firm. It only knew the truth of the North. He told Leo that as the world became more virtual, he would need something that remained true even when the batteries died. As the fire settled into a soft glow, the silence of the countryside felt like a shield. The corporate entities were likely in a state of frantic repair, their optimal paths temporarily erased by the absence of electricity. But here, in the cool air of the Midwest night, the human spirit felt indestructible. The things they loved were disappearing. The stores, the open roads, the privacy of a whispered word. But the essence of what it meant to be alive was still there, tucked away in a box of old photos and the steady vibration of a compass. Elias looked at his family and then out at the dark horizon of an uncertain America. In 10 years, when everything you know is gone and the world you once walked has been replaced by a digital ghost, who will you be?